welcome back to day 3 of Sci-Fi 2020, where we return with the first panel of the day on the future of workplaces and workforces. I hand over to Utkarsh, who is moderating the panel. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to moderate this discussion about the future of work. This is such a broad subject that we can go on for days discussing it, but I've decided that for the 45 minutes that we have, let's try and understand the nuances of gig work, the role of government, and what does work look like in the post-pandemic era. This is not meant to be a complete or a comprehensive discussion, but just three things that jumped out at me as something that we all need to think about, because there aren't straight answers to this question. I'm the moderator, so I'll be asking some questions. It'd be interesting to hear from our panelists about gig work. I mean, it has added so much economic value. It has enhanced productivity. There's been huge consumer surplus created for all of that. But at the center of all of it are the Uber drivers, there's the platform, and then there are consumers. Let me start by asking in a popcorn style to anyone who wishes to answer, are Uber drivers employees of the company or are they independent contractors?
To your very direct question about whether Uber drivers are employees or self-employed or independent contracts, the answer is super simple. They are very clearly employees. This is an issue that's been going on much more fiercely, probably not as much as in India, but in the rest of the world, especially Europe and US, especially with the California judgment and other judgments that have come by, both for the taxi drivers as well as for delivery workers, saying that they are very clearly employees. Now, where does this entire notion of an employee come in? The notion from the companies like Uber is you're a self-employed or an independent contractor because you have the freedom to decide when to work, where to work, and how to work. But in reality, what the Uber app basically does is it mediates work between a customer, a client, and the worker. The very act of mediating this work and sort of actually managing the entire allocation process as well as a payment makes the relationship very clearly that of an employee. And for me, that's very clearly, and all the judgments that have come by have very clearly shown that they are employees. So I'll stick there.
Interesting. Others? Please, Victoria, Sangeet, and Andreas, in that order.
I will give you, I'll probably give you the case for Russia here because we have something, not just Uber. We do have Uber in Russian, but we also have Yandex Taxi, which is also a comprehensive platform that it works on a similar mode.
And BlaBlaCar.
Yeah, they definitely are employees, not only because of all what Uma has just said before, but in fact, at least in our context, we rarely have independent ones. Usually the drivers of the taxi in Yandex or Uber, they are members of some of the taxi companies. And nowadays their progress have moved so far as to include within the platform several other companies, but not individual drivers. And it looks like even if they don't have direct personal contracts with the platform itself, they do have a contract with their proper taxi company, which certainly have to be responsible and going along all their necessary social safety net and social protection package. So I think the answer is quite clear with that.
Yeah. So Victoria mentioned an important point about Yandex. But to the best of my knowledge, this French unicorn BlaBlaCar is also in Russia, and it's actually doing really well in certain areas. And BlaBlaCar is basically, suppose Sangeet is driving from London to Paris. I just tag along and I pay her for the ride so that we split the cost. So she's not exactly my driver, we decide to split the cost. So that also is a very interesting nuance. So will a person, Sangeet, driving from say London to Paris, become an employee of BlaBlaCar or not? Sangeet, since you've been called out, so tell us, are you an employee or are you not?
Well, I would like to say I'm an employee, but I think the Indian government hasn't made that distinction very clearly yet. We've still not gone far enough. In our recent labor codes, we're still sticking to the gig worker definition. So we've defined gig workers separately, platform workers separately, and an employee separately. But these are very overlapping definitions. So India has actually gone the way of ambiguity, which is not really the best way to go about it, I think. I also think that on this debate, the Uber CEO had some very interesting things to say. And he said one thing which really struck me. He said that we have, there's a trade off between flexibility and having an employment status. And what workers really need is flexibility. I think that's a very false dichotomy. So I would just like to point that out in this conversation because I think this is really important because having a minimum wage or being able to take leave if you're sick, that does not mean you lose flexibility, right? And what gig workers have right now isn't really flexibility. It's really a lack of choice and a relationship of dependency with their employer.
Gotcha. Really interesting point. We'll come back to it. Andreas, would you like to weigh in?
No, I think, I agree with everything which has been said, but as everything in the gig world, we are speaking about hybrids. So my answer would be that the Uber driver or the driver is all the three of them. In one hand, it's an employee of a company. But if you look at the social security aspects of it, how these drivers are treated by law in many countries, they're kind of self-responsible for their social security stuff. There's a minimum in some countries. So it's also kind of true that they're self-employed. And when you look at that they need to bring their own cars, which is not paid by Uber, then they're also subcontractors to a certain extent. So, I mean, we are speaking about a hybrid model of a category of an employed, of a self-employed. All the three is true of them.
Yeah. So, dear listeners, there's a very interesting debate going on, and the four panelists have spoken about it. But I encourage you to also read an op-ed written by the CEO of Uber in the New York Times, where he talks about why he's feeling deeply emotional about the plight of the Uber drivers for some reason. And he goes on to explain. And then it has been strongly criticized by another CEO called Managed by Q. That company was bought for $220 million by WeWork earlier this year, and he basically rebuts that argument. Now, I, as a moderator, don't have an opinion, but I do encourage you to read that so that you can understand all of it. Essentially, it's the pro and con. Is making employee, is it so simple? If it were, why doesn't Uber and other gig economy do that? So panelists, tell me, do you see any challenge at all in making Uber drivers full-time employees or part-time employees, or do you think it's going to be an unmitigated blessing for everybody?
I mean, if I can jump in on this, I think the question is, 60% of all the jobs worldwide are informal jobs, and the question is, how do you ensure a certain level of formality and a certain level of protection for these drivers in a gig economy? And I think we are only at the beginning where there needs to be a dialogue, there needs to be governmental actions. That's why in some countries, for example, my own Germany, Uber drivers are not allowed to drive freely unless they are registered as taxi drivers. So there is in a number of countries this dispute how you can kind of build in an economy and a system where some informal work is translated into more formal work, which goes hand in hand also with social protection. And let me make one final point. Now in the COVID crisis, we have seen that we've lost 15% of the working hours, which is equivalent to 400 million jobs. And all these jobs are kind of gone. And this means that if you don't have social protection or any system in place which helps you to overcome this, then we have a big problem on the social side. So it's not that easy just to inject flexibility in the markets and just to go down the brave new world of the gig economy. Sometimes formality also brings some assets.
I want to extend the argument that Andreas is making, and I think that's a very, very important point in the sense that the fact remains that if we are even talking about a country like India, where it's about 90 to 95% of the workers in the informal economy, and it is true that even when you're talking about taxi drivers, traditional, they were part of the informal economy. But what is happening now? I think that's what is very problematic. One does talk about flexibility and the independence, but the workers often do not have any autonomy or control over the work that they actually do, because there's a lot of penalization that happens. Like if you don't take a particular ride or you refuse a ride, your ratings go down, your work, you're not properly paid, and you might not get more rights for certain reasons, and there might be certain discriminatory aspects that are happening. So I think what is under question today is the business model of Uber. I think one needs to, and this is something anybody who's interested can go and actually look up at the Uber report 2019 that is released now. Good thing is Uber is a public company, and because it's got an IPO, its reports are out for scrutiny in the public. And if you look at the Uber report carefully, you'll find that they themselves very clearly say we have not made any profits. They have made substantial losses.
Yeah, I just want to take off from Uma's point about how they don't have adequate compensation, but they also don't have adequate visibility. Now, here I'm not talking about just gig workers. I'm also talking about platform workers, who are people at the back end of AI systems and pretty much invisible. In fact, until some scholars like Mary Gray wrote about them, nobody really knew what content moderators are, for example. So this business model of hiring platform workers is really based on the problem of plenty. There is so much supply and there's very little demand, and this business model is very unsustainable because these people are, because of being invisible, they have no way to form solidarity networks, they have no way to redress their grievances. So this is a problem which is, if we do going back to your question, this is a problem for workers, this is a problem for the government because they're not visible, and this is clearly not a problem for companies who have tech companies have traditionally resisted unionization. So I think, yeah, that's about it.
That's a really interesting question. We're going to come back to it. But Uma, Victoria, do you want to weigh in a little bit? Because there is some data available about this on things like how much does a Yandex driver earn? How much does an Uber driver or Lyft driver earn? So Cornell University basically analyzed data from two competitors, both Uber and Lyft, and figured out how much does an average Uber driver earn. So it turns out that an average Uber driver, according to their research, earns about $23 an hour, which is more than 3 times that of the minimum wage in many states. This number is huge, but there are some scholars who are questioning this number, saying that this number 23 per hour seems a bit high. And the scholars and the people in Cornell who've done this research, they also identify some of the real challenges come not with the way people make money, but about what is considered work and what's not work. For example, if I'm a receptionist and I'm waiting, sitting in my table, waiting for the phone to ring. But while I wait and the phone doesn't ring, am I working or am I resting? Logic will tell that I'm working, right? That same logic is not applied when it comes to many gig worker type. So waiting for a ride is only in certain studies counted at work, whereas a lot of scholars question it. So there's a lot of stuff to it. But $23 per hour is very high by any standard. I would imagine that most of you will disagree. Perhaps you want to share some of the challenges with such kind of analyses and what the listeners should be careful about.
What I wanted to earlier argue or make the point is that Uber's been making a lot of losses, but despite that, it has been getting a lot of venture capital funding. And I think that's where the entire financing of this whole system is very problematic. So there's a lot of cross-subsidization actually going into this entire sector with the whole idea that there would be one final winner, and that winner is the one who's going to actually make a lot of revenue. And in this process, there's a lot of accumulation that is going on. So I think one needs to fundamentally question the business model, and this is where I think the government regulation and the government needs to actually intervene to understand what is happening actually. So I think I'll leave there. And to your point on the wages, I think I'll come back after Victoria's intervention.
Okay, thank you. If you don't mind, I will make it a bit wider. So not just concentrate on Uber, but since we're talking about digital economy.
Yeah, Uber is just an example. We don't like or dislike Uber. It's just for reference.
I'm okay with Uber. The problem is that in our current conditions, none of our countries have proper legislation to deal with the new types of businesses.
Absolutely.
And I think this is problematic. And I think that's what ladies were talking before about, is that actually, in order to provide for social security, we do need the government to jump in. And it probably would take international community or intergovernmental exchange of best practices of how to allow for the rules to be worked out and how the legislation to be brought in order for such new ways for business arrangements to be brought into life, and to ensure both workers' rights and their health and their safety and their and their proper development. But at the same time, of course, we do have to think about their employers who would not be going into business unless they can have proper profits and proper functioning. So it has to be both ways. And of course, the government has to be there in a way, a moderator. With regards to wages, I can tell you that this could be regarded differently, but do you mean that they make this money net?
Yeah.
So
this is public information. Yeah, this is
after they give 1/3 to the platform, because this is another
this
issue.
is including that and removing fuel costs, everything.
Okay, because usually, and this problem also goes wider. It doesn't only apply to Uber and its workers. We're also talking about other gig economy, like we have Apple, we have other providers, and then how much they charge for the apps that they are introducing. And we just had very kind of quite a lot of discussions and talk about the trials that are going on because of their discordances of how the new digital monsters are working and how they are treating the smaller companies, the smaller apps. And I think this could be compared, because this is also like a startup. So people who are offering their work and their know-how, and then they have to have social security net. So I think this has to be looked into each and every aspect, and we need this legislation, and we need government interference.
Yeah, I think
that's why such panels are really interesting. Because I'm an entrepreneur and all of you are more policy people. So I can just see the beauty of having multiple perspectives on the same thing. Because, as an entrepreneur, the first thing that you want is to survive for another day. And as a policy person, you have to say, how do institutions survive for 100 years? So it's just like a very different perspectives that you have to combine. And I'm glad that we're having this discussion. Sorry, Uma, you were saying something?
I just want to come back to your $23 per hour issue. I think it's very
important. This is the report. This is not my research. This is the.
I know this was a very controversial paper, rather. It's been quite a bit of controversy around that, and I don't want to get in there. But I do want to put something into, to put it into an objective way of looking at it. Now, what happens is it's very important to understand when is the analysis done. The different stages. Now, when Uber enters a particular country, I'm again taking Uber as an example, but it could be any company. Whoever enters a particular country or a particular market and you want to expand, what you're doing is, how do you enter that market? You can only enter by providing some sort of a cross-subsidizing. So you're subsidizing both the customer as well as the driver. And you're bringing in a lot of bonus and incentive schemes. Now, even Indian workers whom we have surveyed as part of the work we are currently doing, you find very clearly that when they entered and had the Uber app or the Ola app or any other app, the earnings were like amazing, unbelievable. But that was only there for till you capture that market and you have what they call in this entire literature network effects. The more drivers you have, the more customers and clients you have, and then that's how the valuation of these companies is going up. How does the valuation go? It doesn't go on the basis of the assets you have, but it moves around the number of people that users you have. And after a point actually your incomes actually drop down, and that's where the problem is. When you're earning and being cross-subsidized, they're pretty good. You don't even get into a debate whether you're an employee or a self-employed. It's only later, and this is something that the COVID crisis has very clearly exposed, the precarity that exists for many of these workers. So I'll stop there.
If I may, let me jump in.
We do have to cover a few other subjects. So let me just summarize this discussion in a minute. So this gig work example is obviously really complicated. Like from an entrepreneur standpoint, for example, the point that mentioned by Uma about loss making. So Uber is not the only loss making company. Almost every gig economy is a loss making company, and that is not something which is too surprising. It's almost by design, because this is not a space where unit economics are very easy. So the challenge is that if you still want to pay low costs as a consumer, then you want to essentially make it, or Uber's argument is that can happen with people choosing more drivers, more cars, essentially a demand supply, which will make the prices low. Everybody wins. Every scholars in poly, as Sangeet, Victoria, Andrea, alluding to different, that these don't need to be binary. The net consumer surplus as well as the employee benefits and flexibility can coexist. And I think this is what Managed by Q CEO argues, that instead of treating them as binary if or, you should treat them for a combination of all of them. And obviously Uber is one example, but there are many other types of gig work like TaskRabbit and others, where it becomes really challenging if you start considering every TaskRabbit person who takes up the task as an employee. For example, if I take up, I'm short of money. Suppose I decide to do a project for $100 of annotation. Do I want to be a TaskRabbit employee? No, I don't. I mean, I have other things to worry about. But that's why this is so tricky, and I encourage everyone who's listening in to really dive in and form your own opinion. But one thing that everyone talked about is the notion of flexibility. And work is something that many people are saying is here to stay. We're all having this conference remotely. We're all in different time zones, different countries. When we talk about remote work and flexibility, do all of you, are you excited by it? Are you scared by it? Do you want government to play any role in defining the contours of remote work? Again, popcorn style, any of you.
Maybe I can have a take on this, and also linking it to the debate before. I mean, we are speaking about in a world where 60% informality exists. We need to answer the question, not for the institutions or for the state or for the government, but we need to answer a question for the people. What happens if a driver gets sick? What happens if a country moves into lockdown? Who is paying for the salary in this wonderful, flexible world of entrepreneurial spirit? And therefore, you need a system, and you need to have kind of a certain formality in order, managed by the government, in order to make sure that this is done in a meaningful and in a solidary basis. Because if not, what happened, for example, in the lockdown in France is that the drivers could not drive anymore. And they could ask the government for a certain kind of one-off payments in order to be reimbursed. And this was then paid by the taxpayer. So at the end of the day, your wonderful example about the Uber driver earning $23 per hour is at the end compensated by all the community, by all the citizens of a country to kind of refinancing it back in case something happens. So that's why we are arguing that we need to have some formality for the system. We need to have some backup. We need to have some basic insurance for the people. And this is something which is what social protection is about, and where governments come in and systems come in.
Yeah.
So Andreas, quick one. Suppose companies like these gig economy, they create a fund. They'll say you'll be a temporary employee, but there's an emergency fund. Suppose you have a physical harm, or suppose something goes wrong, you will get X amount of money automatically debited to your sent to your account. Would you be happy with that or sad with that?
No, the issues, I mean, we have this kind of systems. For example, in Europe, you have public insurers, you have private insurers for healthcare. So it does not matter what kind of systems a society chooses, but it would be important that there are such systems in place, and there is a certain democratic consensus about what the systems are, because it cannot be that at the end of the day there is a huge cash flow on the entrepreneurial side, and when there is a problem, all the problems needs to be socialized again. So we need to have something.
Sorry. The entrepreneur, suppose the company X creates an emergency fund for all its gig workers. You fall ill or you have a challenge, you will get money in your account. Are you happy? Are you sad? This is a very binary question. I mean, open to all of you. I'd love to hear your perspectives on this. Yes, any of you. It's impossible for me to pick on the screen.
Can I
Up
go?
to whoever wants to.
Yeah, I think
Victoria,
this is...
Uma, Sangeet, maybe in that order. Yeah.
Okay, I would like to say, first of all, maybe it's somewhat different. As Andreas said, in Europe, the same in Russia. We do have public procurement, not procurement, sorry. We have social security that is provided by the state to everyone. It's supposedly so-called free medicine, free healthcare, which might be of different quality than when you have some extra private insurance, but it doesn't matter whether you become an official Uber worker or self-employed, or you are in a public company or in private company, you have this basic insurance where you are, if you get sick, if you have problems, you will go there. So only one, you have to be a citizen, and then it's there. So probably this is not the problem that much. I would say rather for us, the problem would be when you move to a distance format with the other employers. It's about rather of how much both employer and employee can manage to acquire the result, and how much the state should be interfering, as you said at the very beginning, into setting the rules for this distant work, especially when we had this lockdown.
Like France has, it's impossible to fire people there.
Yeah, we had those. So even private companies were not supposed to fire people, and then they would have had some punishment, and they were they were also getting incentives from the state not to fire. So they were able to get extra credit to pay salaries, the private companies, if they don't fire their employees during the lockdown. So we had such measures coming from the government. But what's also important, and it's extremely vital issue in the time of pandemic and afterwards, how much of this hybrid or distant work would continue, and how much employers and their managers are eager and ready to arrange work in this format, because if you look about Russia, there was a survey among the employers, and they in fact said they didn't like the distance regime. Only about 7% are ready to keep their employers on distance after it's all over. 20% can keep such or have it, but their 80% are absolutely not ready to do this to turn to this model. And this is another vital aspect of how we not only learn how to use digital technologies, but how it could be put into the current, not only legislative, but also our management culture and our culture of business and public work.
If there's time at the end, I'm going to ask you to simplify what you said a lot, because I think some people would want some follow-ups on that. But Uma and Sangeet, in simple words, happy, sad. This is a very binary question.
Okay,
You're
happy,
getting the
sad.
same outcomes with a different fund.
Okay, before I answer that, I want to answer your other question that you had on flexibility and the government intervention. I think one thing that I want to raise and point out, I don't think many people are aware of it, is that there's no governance mechanism that has been put in place actually for all the platforms, whether you're talking about location-based platforms like Uber or Swiggy or any of that, or Upwork kind of, online platforms. These platforms themselves have something called as a terms of use agreement. And those terms of use agreement are the kind of governance mechanism for running these kinds of platforms. And I think it's high time governments actually intervene and then try to take this within their hold and say, well, there are certain rules of the game that have to be followed and implemented, and that is exactly where the legislation and regulations come into play. So I think there
Quick
is a
question,
very
Uma, on this. Do you think governments get technology to such extent, like in such depth? Do they really understand such nuances of technology?
You know what's interesting? Good that you asked that question, because a lot of developing countries, and this is especially in Asia, and you can pick any country you want. India is just not an exception in that. They have all been looking at digital infrastructure in a big way over the last 7-8 years. And they've been attracting a lot of this work within the country, even without realizing that much of this work is not really suitable for India. But the reason why the attraction is there is it's easy employment opportunities without having to break your head as to what should be the new employment policy or whatsoever. So I think they get it to that point, but beyond it, it's very difficult to understand how much is politics and how much is understanding. But there is very clearly a debate in India, which is far beyond many of the other developing countries, with NASSCOM and some of the other institutions, even with regard going all the way up to data ownership. We are quite advanced with regard to it. So I wouldn't say that governments have not been realizing. There's a huge debate even within the UNCTAD about localization versus free trade and all of that. So that's there. So I will say that the awareness is not there, but I think action is not there, and it's high time that the action is done. Coming to your social security thing, I think what you're proposing is no. I think what would work
Uber is proposing, not me. Yeah.
Okay, what you're proposing on behalf of Uber is no. What is
I don't have
interesting
anything to do with Uber, just to be clear. Yeah, one way or the other. Yeah.
What could be interesting is what we sort of advocate as a kind of a social insurance system. And this is a system that is actually working in some of the countries like Uruguay, Indonesia, developing countries, where you have social contributions while the payments are done, so that it ensures that the worker is protected. Then you don't get into an argument saying, do we link employment with from social protection or not? Those are very interrelated things. And you have to, finally, who's going to fund all this? Where's all this money going to come? I think that's a fundamental question that we need to ask. And that takes me back to what Andreas actually has been raising, saying that, come on, working hours are reducing, people are losing jobs, there's a huge informality. Is this the right road to go? No. I think we need protection. Technology can be used more effectively to ensure all kinds of protection to workers, and that's what we should be doing. Thanks.
Sangeet?
I completely agree with Uma. Just taking from that point, I think what the government really needs to do is create a social security floor, so to speak, right? On which So I would be semi-happy with a company having a fund for me, because even claiming my benefits from that fund would be a very difficult thing, which is something we saw from the pandemic. So just in order to not fall through the cracks, I would need that level of basic protection from my government. And then, of course, contributory mechanisms from companies and funds and so on would help a lot. So on that point, I completely agree with Uma. So it's not very simple. It's not something as simple as just delinking social security from employment. It has to be much more nuanced than that. And on your second question, which I thought was really interesting, do governments really understand technology and this form of work? In some ways, I think yes. In some ways, they're really beginning to understand. And in some ways, they're constrained by how obscure and how the complete lack of transparency with regard to this kind of work. For example, platform work is completely behind the scenes. It's not visible to government at all. And one thing I think that the government really needs to do is get better databases, get better data on how their citizens spend their time, better time use data, where they're employed, and so on. And for that, local governments need to be really key. That would help in understanding this economy better, which is so informal.
Right, right, right.
I just want to make one point linking it to what Sangeet said about better data. I think the fundamental thing we need to ask is transparency of data from the platform companies. There's absolutely no transparency. So if you look at the Uber website, it says 3 million drivers around the world providing n number of rides. But are the 3 million actually, where are they? And are they, how
And
much
who
time?
should own this data, out of curiosity?
Huh?
Who should own this data about the 3 million drivers,
No,
geospatial position?
this should be publicly available as to which countries, and also with regard to how many of them are fully working full-time, how many are working part-time, how many are working just a few hours, because and how many of them are actually multi-homing. That is, if you're talking about
Sorry, I want
India.
to make sure that listeners understand what you're saying. You're saying that all the driver information along with location should be public? Is that what you're saying?
Or should be owned by the driver. Or
But
it should be with the national
how would
authority.
that be? Location should be public, and what should be the, perhaps there's a sound issue, I'm not able to catch it properly.
I think with all the information about the drivers, the data, the amount of earnings, amount of driving they do, the algorithm, how the matching process happens, all of this needs to be made transparent and should be made
Who?
available.
That's the question. I mean, nobody's disagreeing with that. Who should have access to it?
I think it should be the drivers and it should be the governments.
You want China, for example, or government of India to have access to all of this data. I mean, I'm just saying that this is going to be a very, very tricky kind of debate
It is a
on
tricky
data.
thing. There is one issue, there is one idea that has been floated, and that's actually a very good idea. How could we have collective ownership of data of many of this, and especially things like this, where it's my information, I don't have any ownership, and all my ownership is actually with Uber, and Uber can go about deciding whom to sell or what to do with my data. I don't even know, how much of a surveillance or monitoring is happening on me using the data I have. And one has to understand very clearly that all of this data is being used for the algorithm matching, for the pricing, and a whole lot of indicators. There's absolutely zero transparency again.
I think
So
we'll need a different debate for that. Yeah,
yeah,
but
sure.
I just feel that this is very, 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 very tricky because this data ownership is something that people are still figuring out. But I do feel that there is a lot of merit in what you're saying. Not all the aspects I agree with, but one aspect that some people say is that Uber drivers or any gig worker doesn't know what's the split between the platform and the driver, or platform and the worker. So I think maybe we can start with that level of transparency, and then the radical transparency that Uma is proposing, we should work up to that. I think it could be a very interesting idea to explore.
How would you talk about personal data protection in this regard? Are you sure those drivers would be happy? about that, including, and it's also because this is another problem that we're now having with their digital economy is the data protection, and it's a huge problem not just for their platforms but for a number of other issues whichever apply to digital technologies. And I think it's a very tricky question.
It's a
Yeah,
pretty
I
tricky
think it's an
question.
issue of both personal data as well as how do you deal with personal data? And at the moment, the way it is being dealt is all the data is actually with the companies. And the question is that the right way to go about it?
Or with the governments in China's case, or in some other, but again, like this will take us in a completely different direction, which I think Trisha will appreciate less than one would have hoped. So we have 5 minutes, and we have 4 wonderful speakers. Unless Trisha wants to weigh in as well, I would love for all of you to talk about just two things that you would want to see in the post-pandemic era, two new things introduced. We haven't talked about gender and inclusion, unfortunately, yet. So if any of you has a strong opinion or an idea, I think now is the time to make it known. I want all of you to share two new ideas or two ideas that you feel want to see and in the workplaces of different kinds in the post-pandemic world.
Sure. So one is a little idealistic, but it's something that's been happening in the world, and it's something that I think we could really take forward now that we're talking about co-ownership of data. I think we also need to talk about co-ownership of platforms, which is something that is happening with companies like Fairmont. So co-ops where workers are equal owners and they have a large voice in how a company is working. I think that's the gold standard for worker rights. So that is one idea which really interests me, and I would be really happy to see that taken forward. The second thing I think is for governments to really leverage local government, at least in India, to really leverage the power of local government better in creating better databases for workers. I think that's a starting point for regulation. Unless all kinds of work is visible, unless all kinds of work are valued equally, or at least valued enough, I don't think regulation can have as big an impact as we'd like. So that's two ideas. Yeah, that's where I'd like to go.
Perfect. I want to hear from all of you, Victoria, Andreas, Uma, two new ideas for the post-pandemic world.
Sure. Maybe they're not as new. You just mentioned their gender issues. And I think, in fact, digital technologies do bring us extra possibilities for women to participate more fully in their economic cooperation and to offer economic empowerment. So probably their new regulations, new discussions should be more centered about less of lack of gender bias when we're talking about elaboration of new technologies and ability for women where it is relevant to access more digital infrastructure and allow for education to be reformed this way around. About the rest, well, I think we need to rethink this physical versus virtual presence of the workforce after the pandemic. So it should not be just there. We cannot substitute physical presence and physical interaction and cooperation, but maybe we should try to look and find the proper mode of combining both in order to provide for more efficiency, but remain within the scope of human communication. So I think those are two main ideas I'd like to.
Thank you, Victoria. Andreas?
Thanks, Utkarsh. I think two things. First, basic social protection for everybody. Bring down informality from 60% to 10%. Second, we need to be serious about the no child left behind policy. So access to internet in all schools, so that not where you live decides whether you can have homeschooling or stuff like that. Access to laptops and iPads for everyone. Public-private partnership for that between big tech companies and governments to make this a reality in many of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Uma?
Thanks, Utkarsh. I think Andreas stole my first point, but I'm going to reframe it and say that one of the things I would like to see is very clearly regulations and protection of workers. And I think that's very fundamental, and how to actually formalize workers. I think that's one. The second thing is, I think one thing we have learned from the pandemic, and I think there are lots of negatives, but there's one thing that came out super positive, is the whole issue of environment and reduction of pollution during the pandemic period. And I think the pandemic also showed that remote working can work. It's not such a big thing. So I think one thing I'd like to see after the pandemic is how can we combine remote working with physical presence to address this whole issue of both congestions and reducing pollution and improving our environment. I think that will do a huge help to the society in the coming years. Thank you very much.
No, that's wonderful. And I'm the moderator. I mean, I just want to make one point. I know many of you who are listening in have lost jobs. Many of you will lose jobs. I mean, while workers get protection, you do find yourself in a position where nobody's looking out for you. This is really unfortunate, but this pandemic will also unleash passion economy. So this is your time to create your own job. Please don't wait for the governments to create jobs for you or big corporations to create jobs for you. They will not, at least not in the short term. As they figure it out, you will have to rely on networks and rely on systems that Sangeet alluded to, my Andreas, Victoria all alluded to. You'll have to create some of that yourself. Study the passion economy well. This is also the time for passion economy to blossom. I learned so much from listening to all of you. Thank you very much, ORF, Sci-Fi, and talk to you very soon. Bye. Bye, Trisha.
Thanks, Utkarsh.
It's such a pleasure.
Victoria, for tuning in.
Thanks to RF.